Hi, everyone. I don't think I'm that famous. I hope I'm not, because then you have more expectations than I can probably fulfill. Hi, I'm Martin. He told you. I'm going to talk a little bit about card games, about digital card games. I hope you know that this is what I'm going to do, because the title of the talk in the program just said Hindu Shuffle, and I'm thinking everybody's probably confused by that. Just to clarify, the Hindu Shuffle is a specific way to shuffle cards. If anybody wants to learn it, I can show you later. And it comes because the game I'm working on, and which prompts me to talk about card games, is very much inspired by Indian culture, which is part of my background. So let's start off with that and start off with some context so you know where I'm coming from, why I'm talking about card games, and what kind of card games I'm going to talk about. So the game I'm working on is called Nowhere Profit, which is this thing, which is also the fan blog up here. It's the people that help me with it, and they all wear cool T-shirts. And it's a roguelike deck building game. That's a little bit of a weird, huge buzzword block there. It's not as complicated in play. There's a travel mechanic that's procedurally generated. That's an important distinction. And you travel across a post-apocalyptic landscape. And whenever there's a combat, you play a card game. And during the travel, you can build the decks for the combat. And that's it at the heart. If you want to give it a try, we're over there in the village, in the Indie Arena booth, and you can sometime after lunch we'll be back there, and you can give it a try and pick up some swag. I have a quick trailer so you can see how it looks in action, which should hopefully play now. Does it play? It does play. Yeah. So at the top is enemies, at the bottom is your guys. Each of your guys has their own deck, which you can see below them. And then you play the cards to attack the enemies and do things that are awesome and win the fight. All right, so that's the context and the background for what I'm going to talk about, or where I'm coming from. So, because we can talk about the trailer for a very long time, but I think that's always pretty boring. Let's just do a quick overview of the different things I'm going to talk about. The subtitle for the talk is a tour through digital card game design. So I have a lot of things I want to touch on. It's probably not going to go into terrible detail on each of them, but the idea is to give you a good grasp of the many things that you need to think of when you try and build a digital card game. So what is this? One thing is the system design, which is how does your game get the game rules, how do they get together? The second one is the card design itself. So how do your cards act and interact? So I've built that talk and I've hated it and then thrown it out and built it again and made all these little terrible scribbles. So this is a card. This image is going to appear a bunch of times. It's not a Game Boy. All right, so it's a system. It's the actual cards. Then this topic of decks, which is very important for card games, or for some of them. Then we're going to talk about the visuals a bit, like how do you display that on screen and how does it work? And then a brief bit about technicals. If somebody's interested in that in more detail, feel free to come up to me later. I didn't want to go too deep into it and get kind of weirdly technical in Unity. But if you're interested, hit me up on that. So let's start with the system design. The first step is to figure out what kind of game we're talking about. So this is a game box with a question mark on it. So the kind of game I'm going to talk about has cards at its heart. Cards are at its most basic form. Cards are just a very flexible game piece. They've been around for over 1,000 years. They can be seen in a lot of games. But the kind of games we look for are just where these are the central play elements. They're not one thing that generates random outcomes, like in Monopoly, where you have like a stack of cards for like random events. But they're the central playing pieces. They're the token, they're the actions you can do, and they're your interface. And we're also going to talk about cards where the cards themselves is what I call, or what a bunch of people online call, exception-based game design. So where the cards have special rules on them that break the regular rules or extend the regular rules of the game. This doesn't necessarily have to be digital. Like a lot of the things I talk about will be applicable to regular card games as well, but a bunch of them will be digital only. I keep thinking that if you do a digital card game, you kind of want to do something that's uniquely digital, that makes sense for it to be a digital card game. In the case of Nowhere Profit, it's a single-player card game, which is unusual. There are single-player card games out there. I mean, stuff like Solitaire has a huge following, and that works. But there's no, like, card games play against an AI. That's just not possible in real life. So if you want to do a digital card game, you could think about what you can bring that's unique. About that, though, that also makes paper prototyping more difficult. So one of the things we have also is you have a way that targets are generated for the cards. And when I built the paper prototype, it was really like fuzzy to actually, like, whenever you draw a card, you need to roll a die to randomly determine the target. And that's the other side of, if you do a digital game, make sure you do something that's cool about it in the digital world, but also be aware that this is going to make paper prototyping more difficult. All right, so we're talking about card games with an exception-based design. So, and if you go and try and come up with a game system, so how do the rules work? How does the game come together? There's one thing that's true for all games, I think, but it's doubly true for exception-based game design, and that's simple but deep. If you're not familiar with a concept, it means that the game is easy to grasp and to get into, but it has a lot of depth and complexity that unfolds over time that is difficult to master. Yeah? This is really, really important for exception-based game design, because if you have a very complex basic set of rules, and then you add a very, very complex set of cards and card interactions on top of it, and exceptions and special rules and special conditions, then things will get really out of hand. So one thing we had in Overprofit, we had one challenge we have is you have a bunch of cards, and you can play these cards on enemies, but you can also scrap these cards, which means you can throw the card away for some resources. And that's an extra rule that doesn't necessarily need to be there. It does need to be there because I want it to be there. But that's really difficult to explain, because it's one more thing that's required for the player to understand, while he has also the need to figure out all the cards and how they interact with one another. In an earlier prototype, we had yet another action that was not on the cards that was included in the basic rule set that was called cycling, where you could skip your turn and then discard all your cards and draw all your cards again. But that was, again, a simple basic rule, but its interactions and it made the basic rule set more complicated and distracted from the rules on the cards. So if you want to build a card game with exception-based game design, go and come up with a very, very simple, basic set of rules. And to do that, there's a bunch of things you need to look at, need to keep in mind. And the first one, I think, is the player actions. What can the player do? It's obvious that they can play cards. It doesn't have to be. You use a different mechanic to bring the cards into play or work with the cards. But usually, you have some kind of hand and you play your cards. And then there's going to be actions that are going to be caused by your cards, which you need to be aware of as well. Usually that might be something like drawing cards or selecting cards. And then there's a question of other actions, like do you create things on the board? Do you interact with these things? And in stuff like Hearthstone or Magic, you use your cards to summon creatures. And then you have actions with these things on the board again. And it's really important to have a good sense of these possible actions, and to keep the basic actions minimal, but have a wide variety of actions that can be caused by the cards. So we had playing and scrapping and cycling and ending the turn, which is also an action. And that was too much. So it's more interesting to see what kind of actions you can generate from the cards and from the stuff that's on the board. It's also really important for you to be aware of the kind of actions you can have directly from the player and caused by cards. Because when you're looking at a technical solution, so when you're thinking about how the hell I'm going to build this in code, it's really, really good to know what the hell you're doing and what the hell the cards can trigger and cause, and how they can kind of spiral. So these things are basically the building blocks with which you'll build cards later on. Okay, so one part, player actions. The second one thing you need to look at is card effects. What are your cards gonna do, and how are they gonna do it? This is how they'll change the state of the game. They can cause one-time effects. They can cause effects that stay in play for a while, like buffs. The cards themselves can remain in play. Cards can have positions, like in the hand, in the deck, neighboring cards, or whatever. They can be a resource, which we're using with the scrapping, where you can just discard a card. And I think Scrolls also had something. If you've played God, how's the team called? Mojang, yeah, thank you. The Mojang game Scrolls, where cards have resource values and you can discard them for them. And something that's very unique to the digital world is your cards could react and change. Hearthstone uses this a lot. They have a card like if you take damage, it gets cheaper and that kind of stuff. That's a lot of fun. And when you think about the card effects, it's really important because you want to have complex interactions and interesting things that kind of work with each other to provide the depth in your game. It's really important for you to have cards that remain in play, or cards cause something that remains in play, so you can then later on interact with that. Because in our Prophet, we have one issue is the cards that you see on the bottom or in the top, they're actions. They're always, the metaphor for the game is you have a kind of combat situation, and you draw a random hand of cards from the deck of the character, and that symbolizes the current combat situation. You have a clear shot on that guy, you have a chance to take some cover here, and so on. That's kind of the metaphor behind it. So the actions are always, the cards are always actions. That means they're always transient. When you play it, they're usually gone. There's cards that's going to cause permanent effects, but that reduces the amount of things that are in play, which makes it more difficult for us to have cascading effects. So that's why we have buffs. So you have a buff on somebody, and then you can interact with the buff and with the state of the character. But having cards that generate, that's something that Magic and Hearthstone do really well. They have, you create a certain enemy, certain minion, and you can play something on that minion, and then you can, again, interact with the minion that was changed by the card. So you can have a very complex and layered structure there. As I said, it's really important for you to, if you want complex interactions, to make it so that you have stuff that's in play and that changes over time, that your cards affect, and other cards can affect in turn and kind of spiral out of that. Another thing that's really important when it comes to cards is the resource development. So how does the one single match play? Most exception-based card games have an expanding resource game, so you don't start with everything. You start with a limited set of resources, and that builds up over time. If you know Magic, they use lands, so you have lands in your deck, and you have to place lands to generate mana to play spells. If you know Hearthstone, they have a different system where every turn you get more resources to build, to play spells with. The good thing about an increasing resource game, whether you have it as part of your deck building, whether it is in Magic with the land cards, or with Hearthstone where it's just part of the game, is that it automatically creates a sort of upbuilding tension. So in the beginning, you have smaller cards, less valuable, less impactful, and towards the end, you have higher damage, more impactful things to play to have like the tension ramps up and the kind of stuff you can do. It's also more interesting for deck building. If you imagine you can always play any card you have, you would just put in the best cards you have all the time. But if cards have different costs, you have to balance them, and you have to kind of have a deck that is able to play with a limited amount of resources and is able to be played with a large amount of resources. So late game and early game and all that kind of stuff. So that's something you need to think of, how are resources going to change, or if they are going to change, how are they going to change over play? How much do I want the player to be able to work with that? Like, should they be able to affect the speed with which resources increase? Is that something that maybe is going to cost them something, like a slot in their deck? In Magic, if you have too many lands in your deck, you will be slow because you will have a lot of mana, but you won't have a lot of spells because you can only draw one card a turn. So that's an important part of this. It's also something that helps you balance, because as soon as cards have costs, you can kind of move costs up and down a bit to work with that, which gets us to the power curve, which I'll come to back later in the talk. And one more thing, which is kind of obvious, but maybe not, or at least it wasn't to me when I started. You can make a turn-based card game, and you can make a real-time card game. There are real-time physical card games, which are usually very hectic, and you often hurt somebody because you slap their hand with a card or something. That works, but you need to be really careful, and I think for exception-based game design, real-time doesn't work. The reason why it doesn't work, and I've actually tried that for No Profit, an early version which looked like this, had a real-time component to it, The reason why it doesn't work is because the board is very, very complex. There's a lot of things, when I talk about the board, I mean basically what you're seeing, like the interactions and the visuals. Because there's so many things you need to be aware of and so many rules and special cards that if you're on a timer, you will not be able to make the right decision, or you won't have the time you need to. Otherwise, if you give enough time, you'll lose attention. So I don't think real-time works for exception-based game designs, but if you manage to build one, let me know. And one last thing is randomness. If you have a deck building system, and if you have you always have a random, or you usually have a random aspect to that. Like you build a deck, and then usually it gets shuffled, which is not something you need to do. There's some games where you can build a deck, and the sequence is important. I played a bunch of these, which were like really simple character-based card things where you just spawn creatures and then they fight against each other, and they were very automated, very browser-gamey. They had a bunch of, the deck doesn't get shuffled, so the way you structure your deck over time is also important. But usually you have randomness in your deck. You can also have randomness in your cards. This is again something that Hearthstone does a lot. They have a lot of random effects, like at the end of the turn, this character attacks a random enemy for 8 damage. The good thing about randomness is it makes it more accessible, because if you're not good, you can still win with luck more easily. But it also adds like moments of tension where you're like, oh yeah, give me that one minion out of the unstable portal. I need that one random guy from the, I don't know how many could come out of there. But it also can be very frustrating if you lose a game, if you have a multiplayer game, and you lose a game because somebody just has dumb luck. As I said, randomness, something to think about in every game, I think. Okay, so much for the systems. Let's talk a little bit about the cards themselves. The system is kind of like the scaffolding, like the grid within the larger rule within the card, within which the cards generate your actual play. So if you have a system, you probably also have a card. The first idea is what kind of stuff does my card have? Usually you have these things. You have a cost, like how much is this going to cost? If you have a sort of resource mechanic, I said it's very useful for balancing purposes. Then you usually have a type. It could be it's a minion card or a spell or whatever. And then the card has a set of rules that it has when you play it or when it's going to be activated. And here we get back to the power curve I mentioned earlier. And the power curve is basically effect of the card divided by cost. And that kind of generates, if you map that on an imaginary scale, you get a sort of curve there. So you want the more valuable cards, which you can play less often, to be more powerful in exchange, not just linearly. And that's something you need to figure out. Like you have this, let's say you have creatures, and creatures have attack and health, and you need to know how much a creature should be at which power level, which is what I think of as core cards, which is where you start with or you should start with, I think, when you build a set of cards. You need to figure out how your power curve feels and where it is, and that you probably best do that with boring cards, with standard things that don't do anything special. It's just, okay, this does some damage, this creates a monster, but that gives you the idea that, okay, so 2 cost is worth 1 health and 1 damage, or like 2 direct damage or whatever. And that's something you can do with these simple cards. They allow you to have a basic set you can play with, which you need, otherwise you cannot test your game. You don't know what the hell you're doing. And they help you pin down the power curve, because if you play and you notice you're not playing that card, we keep drawing it and you're like, I'm not going to play that. You know that it's probably priced wrongly, and if you draw a card, you're always going to play that. You just don't even think about it. You know it's probably too cheap or too good for what it's doing. So I feel like that's a good way to pin down your core power curve. You have your system, you have a core set of cards, and then you can play that, and you can get people to play that, and maybe even do some data analytics on it, see which cards get played and which cards don't. And then you can use that to kind of fine-tune your power curve and have something on which you can design the more complex rules. And when it comes to the more complex rules, the important part is that they're interacting with one another. That is what's going to give you interesting combos and interesting effects. If you just have this one's more awesome and because it does damage and creates a creature, then it's boring. But if it creates a creature that also has a weakness that somebody else could exploit, things get interesting. And I mentioned it before, to do that, you need to have cards remain in play. But it's not only that, you also need, I think, keywords. Keywords help with the card interactions. There's something like creature types or spell types, or like card colors. Magic has a bunch of axes on which this works. So spells have colors. It could be a red spell or a blue spell. They also have card types. It's a spell or it's a creature summoning spell, or it's the creature when it's been summoned. And then the creatures have types again. So this could be a goblin or an orc. And they even have two, like there's orc shamans and orc warriors, and there's a bunch of keywords in there. And that allows you to create cards that interact with these keywords. So +1 to all goblins, or if you have any red spell on the board, take 2 damage. And these allow you to create interesting combinations just by the card types, which they don't need to have any. So a goblin doesn't need to have any special rules by itself. It's a goblin, and then by virtue of there being goblin buff cards and goblin debuff cards, you have added value to the keywords. And there's another type of keywords as well, which I'll get to again later, is complex or more complex rules put down into one keyword, which you can then easily interact with. For example, in Hearthstone, you have something like taunt. Taunt is a keyword. It's a bunch of rules that's going to be reused all over the place, but it's always going to be called taunt. This creature has taunt, add taunt to creature, kill creature with taunt, whatever. And all taunt does is you can only attack that creature until it's killed. Yeah. But it generates this one keyword that's easy to understand, that's part of the core rules and that you need to memorize, but that you can then interact with later easily, and you don't have to write complex text on the cards. So keywords are really, really essential to building subsets of cards that you can then interact with, which allow you to build interesting decks. So, I'm going to build a goblin deck because that's fun, and I can do that now because there's stuff for goblins and against goblins. So that's keywords and card design. Let's move on to the deck design. So decks become interesting when deck building is involved. That means when the player has a way to adjust, change, build, reduce, whatever, the cards that are in the deck that he's going to play with, they are going to play with. And the issue with deck building, there's a lot of issues with deck building, which I've mostly tried to address with Nowhere Profit. One of the key issues is it requires a very different skill than playing the game. So being good at playing the card game means you know the cards, you know their combinations, you know how they work, and you maybe know what your opponent has and what they might be playing. But building a deck requires you to have a good feeling for randomness, to be aware of the entire set of cards, to do your research. Like if you want to play Hearthstone competitively, you need to know, or even Magic, you need to know the current meta game, you need to research what other people are playing, so you can build a deck that works against that. You need to build a deck that works, because usually there's a bunch of archetypes that are really working well right now, and that's really difficult, I feel, for a lot of people. But the good thing about deck building is it allows you to have like a very strong and very meaningful influence over your gameplay experience. Like, you have built this deck, you've been creative, you've come up with something interesting, and the way it plays is something that you've built and that you can then tune and make better. That's something a lot of people enjoy, and that's a lot of fun. And there's different approaches. Like if you have collectible card games, you have a huge mass of cards, and that usually rotate around where you can build your deck from. And then there's living card games where you have a more reduced set of cards that is not going to grow, because in collectible card games you regularly have expansions to keep it fresh and get people to buy stuff. In living card games, they're more like box sets, and then you have everything you need, and then you can build decks from that limited amount. And then there's deck building games where the building of the deck is part of the game. If you guys are interested in card games and you haven't played Dominion, you should. It's basically it's an actual physical card game, and I'm pretty sure there's app versions of that around. But it's the game that made deck building games, that built the genre of deck building games, and it's really, really good. The core of the game is you have a bunch of cards, and you can buy cards and add cards to your deck, and then you need to win with your deck while you're building your deck. It's really, really cool. So the core issue I have personally with deck building is the decision paralysis. So there's a huge set of cards available. You need to know all of the available cards. You need to know the meta game. You need to have the appropriate cards to be competitive. And that's not as much of a problem in physical play. Like if you have a bunch of friends you're playing with, if nobody goes all out and spends like €1,000 on magic cards, it's fine. Like everybody has a bunch of things and you're playing casually. But the issue with digital games is you have online matchmaking. And you will always hit the wall where somebody just spent a lot of money and is so much better than you that you either do the same or you kind of stall there. Yeah. Which is difficult. There's again some solutions that have popped up in Magic and then in the digital card games. The most prevalent one is the draft mode, and draft is you don't have access to all of the cards. You have a subset of cards that you're presented with, from which you have to build your deck on the fly before you play with it for a while. In Hearthstone, it's just in Magic, it's booster drafts. In Hearthstone, it's called Arena. They kind of solve the problem because you don't have to know all of the cards and you don't have to have access to all of the cards because you have a set you're working with at that moment. But it's also, it reduces your ability to be creative because you kind of need to improvise with whatever you have and you kind of like come up with something really cool and interesting on your from the whole pool. So there's some pros and cons to everything. All right. And something I feel like is often not thought about enough is deck size. So if you're building decks, so if your card has a deck building mechanic, it's really important to think of how big the deck is that people are building. It could be set to a fixed size. In Hearthstone, it's always 30 cards. It could be a min or a max size. But it's really, really important because the bigger the deck is you're building, the longer it's going to take you to build one that works. And also, the bigger the deck is, the harder it is for you to affect the outcome. Yeah, a 30-card deck you have a reasonable chance to get the card you need, and the chance is just going to increase as the deck shortens. If you have a 60-card deck, the chance to get the appropriate card is halved, unless you have the card in there multiple times. That's a separate thing. But I think coming up with the right deck size depends on two things. How long is your game going to be? Like, do you want to come into danger of exhausting your deck, or how long is it going to be? If you have a very long game, you probably need a bigger deck. And how predictable do you want it to be? Like, how much do you want people to be able to build decks and then kind of expect or be able to have the right card when they need it? The bigger the deck, the harder it is to form combos, because combos require you to have the 2 cards or the 3 cards you need to build the one thing you think is awesome. I'm gonna make that goblin a giant, and I'm gonna add +5 to all giants, and then I'm gonna win whatever. I have boring examples here. I'm sorry, but that's something that's directly influenced by deck size. If it's really, really unlikely for you to get these 3 cards, you're probably gonna not build a deck that relies heavily on them, which means you're probably gonna build a maybe more boring deck. So I think it's important to have a deck size that is not too big and that fits your playtime. And of course, it also depends on the complexity of your cards. If you have only simple cards, building a huge deck isn't complicated. If you only have a limited amount of cards, building a huge deck isn't complicated either. But if you have like a 1,000 card set from which I can pick, and I need to pick 200 cards, it's probably going to be weirder than if I have like 60 cards to pick from, and I have a 20-card deck. Okay, so there's so much to decks. Let's go to the visual design a bit. One thing about card games, which I've just mentioned briefly, is in a card game, the card is your core interface. It's the thing the players interact with that contains everything they need. So how do you work with that interface? How do you design that? And one thing about card games is usually that there's the board. It's kind of a metaphor for the tabletop. Sometimes it's more literal than in other games. But it's the expectation that the player comes to when they're coming to a card game. Because a lot of us are very, very familiar with card games. Right? Usually some of the earliest games we play some board games and play some card games with our family. That's probably still true. It was true for me. So we're very familiar with the paradigm of there's a table and there's cards and there's different positions for these cards. And what that means for digital card games is everything that's relevant for you needs to be visible. Because if you play a shooter game, you don't expect there to be a tabletop or any metaphor like this. There's a lot of interactions you can do that are not visible on the screen. You can press forward or back. There's no forward or back button on the screen in a shooter. But in a card game, because you have this very physical metaphor, because cards are a very physical thing, everything needs to be visible, which brings me back to the cycling and the scrapping mechanics we had in Overprofit. They weren't visible in the beginning. They were just kind of, they were visible when you started dragging a card and kind of stuff. And that's really, 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 really difficult because people just did not understand. You see the same in Hearthstone. Hearthstone has something besides the deck you also have a character, and the character has a class, and the class has a hero, what they call a hero power. And the hero power is basically just an effect you can use every turn. But it's very big on screen. Like, it's a huge round thing next to your character. It's very, very central, very visible. If it would be something you need to press W to do this, it just wouldn't work. And what this also means is because all of these things are visible at the same time, you have a very complex screen. Yeah, you have, depending on the complexity of your cards again, but the board is going to be complex. There's going to be a bunch of cards with text and icons and numbers, and then there's going to be some stuff on the screen that's creatures maybe, or I don't know, whatever, and they have effects on them. And you need to think about how you can make this visible and as transparent as possible. I think I've lost my track here. Just a second. Yeah, and the good thing about following this approach of having every action and everything that you interact with visible on the screen is it's easier for people to learn. They don't have some weird invisible interaction they need to kind of memorize and understand. Most of what's happening is visible on the screen. You still have the challenge of you have complex like keywords and rules you need to explain. Like, all right, what is taunt? That's something you can do in like tooltips and stuff. But the board is really important for you to make as clean as you can because there's going to be a lot of stuff on there that's going to make it more complicated. And to the cards themselves, what they essentially are, they're action indicators. They tell you this is something I can do in most of the paradigms. I'm sure you can come up with a card game where that isn't the case. But usually a card is something I can do. And I've mentioned what's on there already with the hero powers and stuff. In Overprofit, we have another sort of challenge. We have a bunch of characters, and each character can play only one card, which is a bit unusual because normally you expect it to be able to play as many cards as you can because a lot of card games are built that way. So that's one of the things we needed to do a bunch of interface stuff to explain and to make it transparent for players. And there's still some wording that doesn't quite work that I need to look at again. But be aware that the cards are your action indicators, that they're what the player wants to do and make them feel that way. And as it comes to the card layout, which is something you can spend a lot of time on as engine, I know we've shuffled this thing around a lot. The key part to this is a strong visual hierarchy. The things that are important need to be readable quickly. And especially since you're probably not going to show the cards in big all the time because you have a lot of stuff on your board, you're probably going to show smaller versions of them. What's really important needs to be readable at that size. And be aware of your edges and your corners because you often want your cards to overlap to save some space. And what's really important needs to be visible. For example, here in Overprofit, these are all cards. You see the thing on the left in the middle is the cost of the card. This is the key information. That's on the left, so even if the cards overlap, you can still see that. You can also still see a part of the image of the card. And then we have this 4 damage you can see on top. We have a type of cards that are attack cards. And it's really important to figure out how much damage they do. That's a key component because you need to attack people and you need to do damage. So that one's bigger. So even if the cards scale down a bit and you have not really the best eyes and you need to squint if it's small text, so we have that big, you can read it and you can understand it quickly. And something that's also really, really important about card games is you need images on your cards. They just do not work without. It's not possible. Even if you do a paper prototype and you print a bunch of cards and you want to play with them, put in some random icons. Just go to gameicons.net, which I love, by the way, and just put on random icons on your cards and then print them. Because what the images on the cards do is they allow you to memorize the image and understand what the card does based on the image. So I don't need to read the text. I can see the image and I know, oh, that's a 4 attack card. And that's all I need. So these are really, really, really essential. And when it comes to the visuals, there's 2 kind of things that I feel are important. One is, since we're working with cards, we're working with a physical metaphor. make your animations feel physical. Like maybe you'll have some drop shadow, have some good easing, so the things feel like they're like slowing down a bit. Don't make them feel like digital objects. Make them feel as physical as you can. And then you don't need a lot of you don't have character animations or anything. You have card images, but you will have a lot of card images. Like if you have a set of 100, 120 cards, it's a solid set for a smaller game. We're aiming for 200 to 300 cards. That's a lot of artwork. That's a shitload of images to make. So try and find a style. Invest some time in the beginning in a style that works for you, that communicates what you wanted to do, and that you can work on quickly. Even if you like what we did, we have the attack cards, of which we have a sizable amount. And these are a lot simpler than the more difficult effect cards. They require more artwork. But that's okay, because the majority of our cards are going to be attack cards. So that's really, really important, especially if you're an indie and you're on a small budget, as most of us are. Yes, and then card text. As I mentioned it before, it needs to be readable even if it's sized down, it needs to be readable quickly. If you've ever tried building a physical game and writing the rules for that, it's an exercise you might want to try. Come up with a simple physical game, write the rules, give them to somebody, let them read the rules, and then let them explain them to you. It's really hard to make rules that people can understand and then that are not ambiguous and stuff. Here, keywords can help you shorten your text so you don't have huge blocks of text. Like one example we had in Nowhere Profit was our cards sometimes they have preset targets, and I've written in targets one random enemy, and the expectation people had was they would play the card. Well, that's the image that goes along with what I'm saying. So the implication with targets one random card is targets one random enemy is I play the card, and then it will randomly select an enemy and play on that. But it's different in our game, because when you draw the card, the target is assigned, so you know which target you have. But if I write in targets one random enemy, which works for me, it doesn't work for the player because they have a different expectation. And that's the core challenge with writing precise rules, making it so that they're quick to read and people can understand them, and be very precise and consistent. For example, there's very important differences that early players might not understand, but that come into play later. Is in Hearthstone you can summon creatures and you can put them into play. And these are different things, because when you summon creatures, sometimes they have effects that come into play, but sometimes when you put them into play, they don't. So these are two different ways to get creatures into play that have different effects and are very, very important for players. And that requires you to be consistent about these. All right, so technical design. Just briefly, because I'm already slowly approaching the end of the time I have allotted. So if you build a card game digitally, there's one thing you need to deal with is the cards as objects, so the individual cards you need to design. Ideally, you want to be able to balance them quickly, which would mean you have a spreadsheet, which is simple. If you just have this one's 4 damage, this one's 2 damage, and so on, that's no problem. But as soon as you have more complex effects, you want something else. You need something else. What we did is we used Unity and had scriptable objects for each individual card, and then have a lot of custom editor scripting, which looks like this. Which looks like this on the right there. We have a lot of custom stuff to define what the card does and how much damage it does, and then it creates a buff and shows the visual effect and all the kind of stuff. In hindsight, I'd probably use a different solution. I think a scripting language is a really simple scripting language for your cards is a good compromise between being able to balance it in a spreadsheet and write your scripting block there, and having the complex interaction available. You could also go and build like a finite state machine system for your cards, which I think is also more flexible than what we did here. So that's something you need to think of. And to build that, you need to know which actions your cards can do and what they can affect. Because before you have that, building the system is not a good idea, believe me. Okay, and the second thing is, when you have the cards and they have a lot of complex effects they cause and trigger and that cascade, There's a bunch of ways you could do this in code. The solution we came up with, we've been using the command pattern. So there's a command handler which gets commands from everything and then goes through them and tries to execute them. And what the cards do when you trigger cards, they actually just generate a set of commands, which is show this effect, then attack this guy, and then do this much damage to that person. Yes. So, and these are then based on the game state. So if something changes in between, the commands are able to react because you have a lot of fluctuation in the game state. So that's the kind of solution we picked. If somebody's more interested in the details on that, get back to me. It's no problem. And I think I'm through, yes. I don't even have an ending sentence, which I always think is shitty, so I'm sorry. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. I hope I had some interesting stuff for you. If you have any questions, shout. So, any questions? Oh, I didn't explain the Hindu shuffle, which is difficult because I have to hold the microphone. What it does is, I'll just show you. You just shuffle the other way around. You have the cards here and you take them from the top, and that's it. It's just a weird way of shuffling, which I'm not really good at either. But which is more common in India and Asia than over here. Any other questions? No questions? Oh, yes. The question was if the game is out, and no, the game's not out yet. If you want to play, come to the village. We're over there after lunchtime. And it's going to be released sometime early next year, hopefully. Anybody else? Or are you all hungry? Yeah. Okay, so the question, or the statement, I think, or the question followed by the statement is, if you design a digital card game, you need a unique selling point. How did we find ours? The origin story of Nowhere Profit is a separate talk in itself, I think, because I came from a timing mechanic and ended up with a card game. I built a prototype I liked, and I thought it was good, and then I thought it was unique enough. I don't know, it just happened in the process. I didn't specifically look for, I want to do a unique card game. I just wanted to do a cool game. I had this I want a party, and I want a kind of traveling thing. So I came from that and ended up with an interesting card game. Anything else? No more questions? I think then we're done here and you can all go and have lunch. I know I will.